No, it's okay.
Newsweek article,
What?
Newsweek article. I told you about.
I didn't check it out yet.
Alright. Okay.
No,
This is the first sheet.
okay.
Yeah, I like the page. Wait, how much was this? Oh, at least 500.
This was 128. You wrote a page and a half of this.
No, like, you said about around 500 words.
Yes.
What I wrote for each was half, 3/4. I'm not doing 5. No. That's not a lot. What there's something you can know. Yeah, that would be.
At that point, you really just have to page.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I'd say.
At that point, you're just in shape.
Right. I wrote 10,000 words in college application.
Yeah.
I hate the characters.
Yeah.
Are we writing a single sentence? Like, and just make it shorter?
All right, guys, we're going to start, and I want to introduce you to Dr. Cosentino, who, as you know, went to Georgetown, behind me, and went to Drexel, where she did her PhD. And rather than wasting more time, I will let you guys start.
Okay. Is it awkward if I'm in here, like I'm in here? I'll be in here with my slides, but we'll see what that one, if it starts working. So, happy to be here. I have to say I'm super impressed at all of you guys. I was reading that website with your blogs on this seminar, and I'm very, very impressed with the kind of stuff you guys have been thinking about, and talking about, and questions you were asking previous speakers. And I'm honored to be here and to be, I think, the first female this year. So, thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. So, I am flexible in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So I've prepared a few slides to just kind of introduce you to the concept of neuropsychology and how neuropsychologists approach the diagnosis of dementia in particular, which is my area of research. Although neuropsychologists clearly work with a whole spectrum of brain diseases and brain injuries. The focus of my talks usually ends up being about dementia, but if if that seems too narrow, you have questions outside of that, that's fine. My particular area of research involves self-awareness in dementia. So I have some slides on that, and that's kind of the stuff that the readings I sent you pertain to. But again, if you're more interested just in learning about how do you evaluate cognition, how do you diagnose dementia, wherever you want to take this is fine with me. I don't have a set of things that I need to get to. So I heard that potentially one of the things you want to hear about is what is neuropsychologist and how is that different than a neurologist or a cognitive psychologist, and what's unique about the way that we think about brain diseases, or what is the role that we play in diagnosing disorders of thinking and behavior. And so, it's funny, it seems like such an easy question, but it's not necessarily so straightforward. So I work in a very interdisciplinary center with lots of people who are interested in the same types of questions I'm interested in. So what happens in the context of an aging brain? How does the aging process, either a healthy aging process or a pathological process, like Alzheimer's disease, how does that affect our thinking abilities and our behavior? And so I work with neurologists who ask very similar questions to the questions that I ask in my research, but we approach things from a slightly different way. And our training certainly is very different. So a neurologist goes to medical school, right, and has a medical training and a very medically oriented view and approach to understanding brain health. So when somebody has, memory loss, for example, say a 65-year-old person comes into the clinic and complains of forgetting names, forgetting recent events, repeating themselves, a neurologist will take a very broad approach to assessing the potential etiologies of that problem. And so they will do medical tests like blood work and neuroimaging and a neurologic exam, which involves testing reflexes and the function of motor and sensory neurons throughout the body to understand the cause of the potential or the cause of the purported memory loss. And so that's sort of the first step of the evaluation. And oftentimes what they'll find is that perhaps there is a reversible cause of the memory loss, like a vitamin deficiency or a tumor or an infection, for example. And in those cases, once the memory loss is reversed and treated, that patient typically wouldn't go on to see a neuropsychologist if those memory problems or other cognitive problems resolved relatively quickly with medical treatment. But as is more often the case in a memory disorders clinic for older adults, the cause of that type of a memory problem, more often than not, is a degenerative process, something like Alzheimer's disease. So in that scenario, what happens is, once the neurologist determines that the brain, in many ways is medically healthy and that there doesn't seem to be a reversible cause of these problems, the question then is, okay, what's the course? Is this person going to progress over time? And what's the nature of the cognitive changes? So this is really where a neuropsychologist comes in. So a neurologist does a relatively brief screening of cognitive abilities called the mental status exam. Just in general, is the person oriented? Can they repeat these words? Can they remember 3 items after 5 minutes? A very sort of broad sketch of where the person stands cognitively. And then they would refer the person for a neuropsychological evaluation, which is a far more in-depth and comprehensive assessment of cognition specifically. So, yeah, please, yeah, because I'm sort of saying some of the stuff that I have visuals for. Yeah, so far, do you guys have, any questions about what I'm saying so far? I'm kind of throwing a lot at you, but just want to get some of these definitions and concepts clear before we go into some deeper issues.
I have a question, but I think it might be more appropriate for later.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
What is it? No.
Well, it just kind of involves, like, if you're testing someone for a certain, like, seriousness of dementia, like, if you look for both physical signs of deterioration and memory loss of objective facts versus loss of, like, recalling of something like an emotion or like a perception, like, what would be a more serious case of, like, lack of self-awareness?
Right. So I'll sort of answer your question now, and maybe we'll get more into it later. But you're asking something that's very important, which is, how does the profile of deficits, like the specific nature of the memory problem, play into our diagnosis and play into what's going on? And so that's one of the things that neuropsychologists spend a lot of time doing and trying to understand is the specific cognitive profile that characterizes not only different stages of a single disease, like mild Alzheimer's versus moderate versus severe, but different diseases. So Alzheimer's disease looks a certain way on cognitive testing, whereas a stroke might look a different way, and frontotemporal dementia would look a different way, and Lewy body disease would look a different way. And that's because those diseases, the pathology that characterize each of those diseases affects different parts of the brain. So I have some slides that when we start working I'll show you, but so for Alzheimer's disease, probably the most important early changes in the brain start in the hippocampus, which is in the medial temporal lobe. You guys probably know this. So this center of the brain, is critical for learning new information. involved in recalling something that happened when you were 5 or 10, but it's very important for encoding and storing into long-term memory something that recently happened to you. And so that's why the typical characteristic memory problem that you see in early Alzheimer's disease is not that the person doesn't remember where they grew up or where they went to college or who their best friends are, but it's what did I do last weekend? And they say, oh, don't you remember, Mom, we went to see, that movie after dinner? No. So it's these isolated impairments in episodic memory, which are these recent sort of new events. And so that's very different than the kind of memory loss we see in other diseases. So frontotemporal, here we go, let's see. We'll come back to this. Let me just see. So this is a picture of a brain of somebody who had frontotemporal degeneration. And you can see that the part of the brain that's very atrophied here is the prefrontal cortex. And so in this disease, as opposed to Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus is relatively spared. So early memory loss is not, even though patients will say, oh, my memory is bad, and their families will say, this person's memory is really changing, it's a very different kind of memory loss. So it's not, if you test people with the kinds of tools that we use where we look at aspects of short-term memory and then the ability to remember information over an extended amount of time, say 30 minutes, these patients who have primarily changes in the prefrontal cortex might have trouble doing well on the task immediately because some of these tests require a lot of strategies and organization. So say, for example, I'll read a list of 16 words and say, tell me them back in any order, all of the ones that you can remember. And we'll do that over the course of 6 trials. So to do that well, not only do you have to have intact memory, but you have to have intact what we call executive functioning or organizational strategies, and the ability to kind of take an organized, coherent approach to the test. And if you're inattentive, or if you're impulsive, or if you're disorganized, you're going to have a hard time saying back those 16 words. But if I ask you half an hour later, what were those words? You might remember a good chunk of whatever you were able to get. So maybe you were only ever able to get 8 out of 16, but over time you still have those 8 out of 16, which is very different from what we see in Alzheimer's disease. So that's just sort of an extended example of the kinds of patterns we look for. Yeah.
What about difficulties in I don't know if it would even be considered memory retention about occurring events, things that are happening in the present, so that someone doesn't have the ability to recognize something that's ongoing.
Like, can you give me an example?
Well, the hemispheric issue.
Oh, like the hemiplegia, so the stroke patients who have no awareness that their right arm is paralyzed.
Right.
Right. So now,
Even when it's shown to them.
right. So now you're getting more into the self-awareness component. Yeah, and that's, I have to say, far less understood than what I would call primary cognitive abilities. So you have primary cognitive abilities, let me get to, which are the typical focus of a neuropsych assessment, and they, including attention, processing speed, memory, language, spatial abilities, executive functioning, which I talked about a minute ago, which is sort of higher, more complex thinking skills, motor functioning, sensory testing, and sensory functioning. So these are generally the topic of a neuropsych exam. Now, self-awareness is sort of like a higher level, right? It's another step removed. It's not just, is there a deficit, but am I aware of that deficit? And as you may have kind of picked up from the first part of this paper that I sent you guys, there's a lot of different theories as to why somebody might have a deficit in self-awareness. And there is still, when I talk to people about awareness deficits in Alzheimer's disease, almost always the first question I get is, well, isn't it probably a reflection of that person's personality, premorbidly? So maybe this person kind of was a perfectionist or didn't like to, admit to weaknesses, or there's some